And I think everyone can ask themselves, like, where am I the bottleneck, and what can I kind of do to no longer be the bottleneck? And the impact can be like, if you're in a leadership position, the impact of that can be very substantial.
Yeah.
And people kind of usually don't have that perspective.
Today's guest is Malte Ubl, CTO of Vercel, which is the front-end cloud provider and creator and maintainer of Next.js, the most popular React framework. With Malte, we deep dived into how Vercel works as a team, what good developer experience look like, and the future of AI-enabled applications. So let's dive right into it. Whether you're building the biggest public API or the smallest microservice, SDKs turn the chore of API integration into the joy of effortless implementation. And with Speak Easy's platform, you can now automatically generate robust, idiomatic SDKs in over 10 languages in just a matter of minutes. SDKs are feature-rich with type safety, auto-retries, and pagination. Everything you need to give your API the developer experience it deserves. Visit speakeasyapi.dev and generate your first SDK for free. Hey Malte, welcome and thank you so much for being here with us today.
Hey, Luca, nice to meet you. And I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So, Malte, you are the CTO of Vercel, which is, of course, the popular front-end cloud provider and also creator and maintainer of Next.js, which is the most popular React framework. So, the first thing I would like to talk about with you is how Vercel works as a team. Because from the outside, Vercel has always moved pretty fast in the industry. And I'm thinking of all the things you do. Of course, the cloud, and then there's Next, and how you started to support AI applications very quickly. So when one thinks about elite engineering teams, Vercel is one of the names that comes to my mind. So my very basic question is, what does your team look like from a 10,000 feet view?
So the way I would describe it is we are a very unique mix of top-down and bottom-up culture. I think what is special about a company like Vercel, but we're certainly not unique in that fashion, is that because we built developer tools and the engineers that build them are using them themselves, there is this
Yeah,
like baseline empathy for what developers want, where you don't have to do market research, you don't have to like ask someone else to ask someone what they want. You just kind of say, what would I like, and kind of start from there. Obviously, that's like you're not the center of the universe. You don't that might not be the perfect answer, but you start out with something that's pretty good,
yeah,
and then you can go and iterate from there. So that's part one. The other part is that throughout the entire organization, we use our product every day.
yeah,
Guillermo, our CEO, I think hasn't like not deployed an app on Vercel every
yeah.
single day in 5 years or so, probably more. Company is 7 years old. So that's kind of the combination where kind of everyone really understands what the product is and how changes would make an impact for our developer audience.
Yeah, that looks like really a superpower, being able to get so much feedback, not just from your customer base, but also from your own engineers. And so, speaking of engineers, do you have like regular product teams with PMs, or you are more like engineering heavy than other companies, for example?
I would say we are engineering heavy, and that is because of what I was saying, that there is a baseline like empathy in every engineer
Yeah,
for the product that we're building and for our developer audience. But otherwise, we are, I think a modern product company that's like in the kind of built on the learnings from, I would say, like Silicon Valley product company culture.
yeah,
And in a way, it's our mission to bring some of that ethos to the wider world. So
yeah,
often we think about ourselves as kind of the meta product company, in the
yeah,
sense that every time we, for example, see that there is a tool missing for our
yeah.
process, we ideally make that a product rather than fixing it only for ourselves and doing a one-off solution.
Yeah, yeah, it's great. And do people work in on independent teams, for example, when it comes to Next, when it comes to Vercel, the developer experience platform and infrastructure, all the, there is rotation? How does it work?
Yeah, so generally speaking, we have three divisions in our engineering team, roughly equal size, but obviously that's like
Yeah,
depends on the day. And we are trying to like, not have this classic separation between infrastructure and product. And that's, I mean, it's easier for us to do because we like our product is infrastructure. And so
yeah,
we do have a division that like they own our primary Kubernetes clusters. They there's technically a small team that does company-wide infrastructure and
yeah.
platform work, but primarily they are the product team. So there isn't like a separate organization that owns like our managed infrastructure product and that's has the infrastructure team as a customer. They one team.
Yeah, yeah, makes a lot of sense. And so I'm thinking that for many people, Vercel is like synonymous with good developer experience, continuous delivery. You've been one of the first to make popular many concepts like preview environments and many ideas that are now a staple of many teams when it comes to DevOps. So how does the whole process works for you? So what's the journey of the code from when a PR gets submitted to when it goes to production? I understand that it may vary based on your product or based on what you're doing.
Totally. So are you asking about what our customers experience or what we experience?
Your
We're also
your your
trying to make
internal
that
experience. Yeah.
yeah. We try to make it mostly the same. So we build as much as possible on the Vercel platform. There are some exceptions. So we do have a control plane that lives outside of Vercel because there are
Mm.
some bootstrapping issues where if we put a bug and then we take down Vercel, but we need Vercel to deploy it, you don't want that, right? Like so
Yeah.
you have to have a little bit of a separation, but we try to make as much of the workflow kind of centered around the Vercel platform.
Hmm.
One thing that's really key to our workflow are obviously feature flags.
Yeah.
We love them. We put them on everything, and we also are right now in the process of making them a first class entity in our product.
Yeah.
So and actually that starts in local development. So right now there's a Vercel toolbar, and you can put into your project. And so it starts when you're on your local machine. You start Next.js, and you put a flag, and you turn it on. Now the system knows for this branch, the developer put this flag. Now you push to production. So sorry, you push to the branch
Hmm.
to GitHub or whatever provider you're using, and then Vercel starts making a preview deployment. And you go there, and it says, well, you had this flag on during local development. You also want to have it on the preview, and you see yes, right? And then everyone
Yeah.
who goes to the preview has the flag. Then you push to production. There, the toolbar exists as well. Obviously, that requires authentication that determines whether you should see it. But then you can say, you can put an override. You can make a cryptographically signed link to your colleague that says, okay, here's production with the flag on. And then we have the flags kind of tunneling through the entire system so that the control plane, backend, etc., all kind of know about the same state of the world.
Yeah, that's exciting. So do you think that's the way the development workflow should work when it comes to even branching and collaboration, like using feature flags from the very beginning on when you're creating a feature? So branches are maybe more short-lived and you push to production as soon as possible with the feature that is just disabled until it's ready to go. So is that how teams should work?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, there's so much pain with long-lived branches
Yeah.
and so much kind of time to validation that goes away if you can effectively ship with confidence as soon as possible. You don't have to rebase all the time. Like there's all these reasons why having long-lived branches is very painful.
Yeah.
It gets even more complicated if you have more than one contributor to a branch. And so we kind of trying to minimize that, trying to keep the PR size as small as possible and have people be able to ship things at very high velocity.
Yeah, I agree. And we always talking about production versus preview environments, but you also use pre-production or staging environments or other intermediate environments in general.
So today, actually, this is not even supported on Vercel. Not really. I mean, people do it. Like you can just designate a preview branch and say, this is my staging environment.
Yeah.
We support kind of environment variables that are targeted to certain branches. This is something we're actively looking at because we know that we have customers that do want to have this workflow, and we're open to it and want to support them. But the workflow that we certainly have is you push, you get a preview, you merge it,
Yeah.
it gets auto deployed to production, and then you use a feature flag to turn it on. And if you want to do QA, you do that on the flag. You don't QA on like a dedicated environment.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And are you opinionated in a way for one kind of workflow or another? Do you think it strictly depends on your product and your team, or can you see that the best teams work more frequently in one way or another, like skipping staging or going through different environments or using just preview environments? I mean, what do you see from your point of view?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm definitely opinionated, certainly for my own teams and what I would recommend if a customer asks, like what they should do. But I'm also, very willing to accept certain realities. But yeah, so the workflow that again we're partial to is one that has very fast iteration cycles and that gets code into production as soon as possible and enables
Yeah.
people to test in production.
Yeah. Okay. And so people, I mean, I'm thinking that last week we had the charity majors as guest of the show, and she advised for the code to go to production as soon as possible. What you just said, so that engineers could test and things in production and see how the instrumented code would behave while retaining the whole context in their head. So is that something that you try to do, like minimizing the time that it takes for the code to go to production so that people could follow the journey of the code to production as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's kind of starts with something you ship stuff to production that doesn't work.
Yeah.
That's not obvious, right?
Yeah.
But that's what a feature flag enables you to do. If you literally have this feature and it doesn't work,
Yeah.
but it's in, right? And now you have this like small PR that does the last mile and that can get a focused review and doesn't have like the 500 lines of boilerplate that kind of put everything in place. And you kind of have to make that jump that is a good idea, but that's
Yeah.
the workflow that we're kind of proposing the world should adopt. But again, like it might not be for everyone.
Yeah, it's funny because it reminds me of the testing workflow, right? When you do TDD, that you start with the test that fails, and then you build the feature, and feels like this is like the larger full stack version of that. So you push something that doesn't work, and then you work until it works, and you enable that on production.
Yeah, I love that analogy. That's actually really good.
Yeah. So one thing that we have been discussing on the refactoring community recently is around engineering management. So it feels like with the more and more good tooling and AI and engineers becoming more and more productive, you hear more and more stories of companies that deliver incredible things with very few managers, very few PMs, or managers becoming more and more technical. So how is it for Vercel? Do you have engineering managers at all? I mean, how is your company organized around that?
Yeah, we do have engineering managers. When I joined the company, we had just hired our first 3 engineering managers. Before that, everyone was reporting directly to our VP of engineering, and so I think they'd been there for like a couple of months. We were still kind of ramping up, and
Yeah,
you could kind of describe the company as kind of a beehive. So beehive
yeah,
have like emergent behavior, right? There's like structure, but the structure doesn't come from organization. It comes from like people kind of following each other and or like bees following each other. And it kind of felt
yeah,
a little bit like that, which is both kind of, I mean, it drives creativity, it drives good ideas, and there's certain people that can thrive in that environment, but it doesn't scale to, certainly not to
mm,
hundreds of engineers.
yeah,
And so we've like since then transformed to more classic organization as we kind of were filling out the slots that we actually need to hire for. I do definitely think though that there is a transformation of the role and
mm,
of the uh, of how people work together.
Mm.
I mean, in a way, that's actually top of mind. We are in a, we have a video podcast, but I don't have a slide. But the way I think about the roles is as a spider graph.
Mm.
If you imagine EM, PM, tech lead, TPM, so kind of the leadership roles in a project,
Yeah.
the the square or like diamond that is like the whole spider graph. That's the job that you need to do, right? And then there are people that do certain jobs, and like you have to fill the whole
Yeah.
thing, but it's not necessarily that one, that you have like the four people who have these very strict roles.
Yeah.
Like for example,
Yeah.
we, I think a very powerful combination is a product focused EM. So
Mm.
someone who has very, very, very deep like passion and understanding and instinct for the product
Yeah.
and uses that to lead their team, right? But then
Yeah.
you can have the very technical EM who has substantial technical contribution still, and but does a little bit of the management side, and kind of all these things going together. I think if you are kind of one dimensional in that
Yeah.
in that world, that that can work, especially in more mature organizations. But
Yeah.
I think it's good to kind of venture outside of the constraints of the role.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So you think in a way that it depends on the scale and the maturity of an organization. That is, the larger the organization, the more opportunity there is maybe for specialization and for people who maybe just fit one of the pieces of the diamond, as opposed to smaller teams where people who can get more, own more of these duties can really thrive. Is that correct?
That is correct, but I would say that so there are like only in the mature or larger organization can you specialize, but that doesn't actually mean that you necessarily need to.
Hmm.
Like you can fill more of the space even in larger organizations, and because organizations even in large companies are never perfect, there's always this opportunity. So, I mean, I was at Google
Yeah.
for 12 years before I was at Vercel, and we, there was always someone, who like a role not filled or no headcount for
Yeah.
a program manager, right? Like it's definitely a thing that there is space for going beyond your current job.
Yeah, and may I ask at Vercel, how many engineers do you have on the team, and how many engineering managers, for example?
So we are at like say 160
Wow.
engineers. And I don't have the count of engineering managers at the top of my head. We are aiming, and I think this is a very kind of traditional way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
We're aiming at the managers having. So, okay, there's two tiers. Either you are what at Google would be called a TLM, where you're a tech
Yeah.
lead manager, you have substantial technical responsibilities, and maybe you manage 3, 4 people.
Hmm.
Um, and we definitely use that model as well, especially to get people into the role and to see how well it works.
Yeah.
And then later, you might manage 8 to 12 people,
Yeah.
depending on again, like your spider graph shape, right?
Yeah.
If you're
Yeah.
very people managed focused, you can definitely do 12. If you do lots of other things, then probably 7 is a more appropriate number.
Yeah. So you would say the main concern is to feel the duties, the duties of the spider graph, the EM role, the tech lead role, the PM and TPM. It matters that somebody does them. It doesn't matter that each of them is done by a separate person. So maybe based on the team, on different teams, you may have the same people owning more of these roles than in other teams that may work differently. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly what I'm saying. And certainly at Vercel, it's very so we have people who work in these roles, but it's very common for a project to not have a TPM. It's very common for a project right now to not have a PM.
Yeah.
And, you know, and it also happens that there might not be like a designated EM because, maybe it's a kind of a tiger team from all over the place. And so no one's like organically responsible for the particular project or product.
Yeah, and so have you seen that this is the result of an evolution of uh, in recent years of tooling making people more and more productive and engineers. So you have been 10 years at Google, now you're at Vercel. You build developer tools. So do you feel like there is less of a need for full-time managers or full-time roles that are not engineers? You have seen these ratios going more in favor of engineers, or do you think there are some evergreen duties that, of course, they're never gone away, but I don't know how much effort you have to spend on them.
Yeah, I think what would so I'm not actually sure there's such a trend,
Yeah.
maybe, but I certainly haven't seen really tooling make a huge dent
Mm.
in the sense that it would kind of make roles so much easier
Yeah.
that they wouldn't be no longer necessary. It certainly makes people more effective, but it doesn't make them unnecessary. What I think the main property, and there isn't a good word for this. So the like the property's ownership, right? So there has to be someone who truly owns the outcome and then just does whatever it takes. And that is a
Mm.
flexible role because sometimes you need to do some product management and sometimes you need to rally the troops
Yeah.
and sometimes you need to go through a ticket list and see what is needs to be done to get the thing out next week, right? And
Yeah.
it really is flexible, but as an owner, you kind of naturally kind of gravitate to to that
Yeah.
to that way. Unfortunately, we cannot use the word product owner because the Scrum people stole it,
Yeah.
and
You can
we
never
cannot
call
use the
that
word
anymore. Yeah.
we cannot use the word GM because it's like general manager, but
Yeah.
it's too undefined, right? At Google, that's a VP plus role. At AWS, they use it for something slightly smaller, and then there's other teams where they kind of use it for the EM plus PM kind of combination. But like it's not well enough. So I don't have a word, but like it definitely does come down to ownership.
Yeah. Yeah, I love this take. So I want to come back to something you said at the beginning, that you said that Vercel is unique in the way that it blends top-down direction with bottom-up input from engineers, from people working there. So uh, how does it work for you? So do you do like longer-term planning and then you adjust and you stay, you keep some lanes for feedback coming from your engineers and customers? How do you reconcile this? These different directions.
Yeah, so we do 3 months planning cycles,
Yeah,
trying to make and actually kind of going more towards half year plus like a mid half update.
yeah,
So that's how we're aligning kind of what we want to work on. And I think it's also important to understand that there is absolutely no kind of there like you can do quality planning and be very iterative, right? These things are actually not in competition,
yeah,
even though people kind of sometimes think this. And so that's one thing. The other thing is that we have on a team by team basis something we call Design Your Friday, where people every so often go and just do something, and then that is, and also people just do things, right? And then we have a weekly demo day, which I'm the biggest fan of. It's like my really only must go meeting every Friday at 8 a.m. and people can just show things. And then it's very, very common that, you know, once when you show it and it's working and you kind of see the impact and you see the response from the audience, that something that, used to be like a 1 day hack kind of turns into the future strategy.
yeah. So is it like, in a way, the 20% time, self-directed time at Google, where you can build anything, and so you recreated that at Vercel?
It's a very similar idea, and it's also something we itself have been iterating on. But what really works is to give people kind of the freedom to build working code, and then it doesn't really we don't do like a pitch, right? People don't come to demo days to like with the expectation that it gets picked up, but they do come, and then it sometimes get picked up.
Yeah, love that. And do you have examples of great product features that have come from these demos, from this 20% time?
Yeah, so I mean, there are a range of these. For example, we have a feature called SKU protection that we prototyped and then eventually shipped. The SKU protection is something that I think your audience might find really interesting. SKU is a weird word, by the way. We can do this quick tangent.
Yeah,
Everyone
no
in big
problem.
tech talks about SKU all day, right? It's
Yeah,
like you have your client, you have your server, and they're not the same version,
yeah,
and you have to manage that, right? And especially if you are on really any technology, you have to you make a deployment, and maybe you have two versions running at the same time, but you certainly don't have n, but you have n clients which haven't updated. And so because Vercel has immutable deployment and is fully serverless, you can actually
yeah,
run every version of your software forever.
yeah,
And so we have a technology where the client can kind of force the front end server to run at the version of the client so that there's zero skew between them. And
okay.
so that's a good example for something that we kind of prototyped and then turned into a full-on product feature.
That's super cool, and it's incredible to think that it came out from. It's a bottom-up feature, you know. It's yeah, it looks like a great example. And speaking of your team, so do you have any challenges or things that you would like to do better? I mean, what's top of your mind right now as a CTO of Vercel?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of what we discussed today is absolutely top of mind for me. Like we are figuring out kind of how roles fit together, how to actually ensure that
Mm.
we use the spider graph analogy that it's
Yeah,
built out, how how to guide people. I think especially on the EM side, should they be more product focused? Should they be less product
mm.
focused? What is the role of the PM in that situation? So that's definitely a challenge. We we try a different topic is that quality is
Mm.
very very important to us, and certainly kind of the security, durability, performance side of our infrastructure
Yeah,
business. I think we're doing a good job incentivizing this,
mm.
like better than certainly Google did, for example, where
Mm.
it was all about the shining new feature,
Yeah,
and you didn't get credit for not having an incident. And so we are trying to see like how to optimize this and have the best outcomes, because we
yeah,
are like, I think you mentioned that we're well known for velocity. I think we're well known for kind of shipping things with high quality, but
yeah,
we're absolutely not satisfied. Like we would like to be better. We would like to have kind of we have a very like one of our big challenges is that we have substantial surface. So we
mm.
support 34 JavaScript frameworks.
Yeah,
They obviously, each of these frameworks have n versions. We
yeah,
we support Python, PHP, Ruby, Go. Very long list of programming
yeah.
languages on our platform, and it's there. Over time, our compute product has added certain toggles. We hate every single one of them because that's another dimension to the testing matrix here, right? And so we are we're working out on like how to, I mean, on the one hand technical solutions to like getting the complexity kind of tested fully, the full kind of n-dimensional matrix, and
Yeah.
on the other hand make better decisions that kind of over time minimize the number of dimensions of this matrix and the number of concepts that our users have to understand.
Yeah, I totally see your point. I think people underestimate the complexity of supporting such a diverse set of languages and stacks. And so the how wide is the surface, for everything from security to performance that you have to support. So maybe Vercel is more well known for velocity, but there is a tremendous technical work behind to make all these things work safely, fast, and so yeah. Is that what you would like Vercel to be more known for, as opposed to maybe today?
Yeah, I I think we do want to be known for great developer experience, great velocity, and great kind of end user performance outcomes. The other things, I mean the bar to like it's almost binary, right? Like the service has to be up. And I think that on the developer experience side, the we're really trying to kind of have the long tail be good, because it's really
Mm.
easy. Next.js, the most popular framework in the world, we make it
Yeah.
ourselves. Um, Great experience on Vercel, sure.
Yeah.
I mean,
Just
we
focus on
try our
that.
best,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But everything else should be great as well. And it's like, and so we are investing very, very substantial amount of resources into getting that kind of matrix all figured out. And I think overall the sentiment uh, is driven by the long tail in quite a substantial way. The Maybe the trauma and the frequent comment from our CEO Guillermo is, I think maybe it comes from from a leaked email from Apple or something like that, where like someone commented like download the app and it didn't work.
Mm.
And like, I mean, honestly, we sometimes have this where like we announce a feature and someone tries it and it doesn't work, and that's the worst thing, right? But
Yeah.
it's extraordinarily common. Like people
Yeah.
ship things that don't work all the time, and like yeah, we try to just not fall into that trap and have things work again. Like it's very easy to make the common case work, right? But like um the weird git setup,
Yeah.
um with the weird backend and
Yeah.
the very uncommon HTTP header, whatever, there's all these scenarios that we're trying to all kind of make work well.
Yeah, I guess it's very complex to keep compatibility and good testing and coverage for all these use cases, diverse use cases, as opposed to, of course, you just focus on the most the happy ones, the most common ones. I mean, there is Next.js and da. But of course, it's another story when you have to test for all these other technologies, for all these other use cases, and maybe that's not what many people understand, even from the outside.
Right.
So another topic that I wanted to pick your brains about is developer experience and developer productivity, because of course you work on products that empower teams to ship faster and better velocity. We have talked about that, and we recently ran a survey on the newsletter about engineering productivity, and what many people said is that sometimes what prevents teams from reaching their full potential is not technology but process. Okay, so it's either too many meetings or too much work in progress, extra long code reviews, you name it, right? So do you have
Right.
any lessons learned or advice for companies who want to create a good development process and developer experience holistically in 2024?
Yeah, I mean, I think about this every day, like, and like it's our product to make it better, and like the what's really worth it, and I think every like engineering leader should do it, is write down the entirety of the process
Mm,
as a one-dimensional thing. Like you can make a complicated Gantt chart, but don't, right? Like say, okay, there's some kind of planning, we make some kind of ticket, developer picks it up, and then developer starts typing.
yeah,
And here's where it starts, because how long does it take from developer writing code to being able to try it out on the local machine? Ideally, 50 milliseconds, but it might be, you know,
yeah,
30 minutes, somewhere in between, right? But we're aiming for 50 milliseconds, investing a lot kind of in hot code material replacement and so forth. So you real time see as you type on the screen how your app looks. And okay, then you push. How long until you see a preview?
yeah,
Um, and it actually really matters whether it's 30 seconds, 2 minutes, 10 minutes, or 30 minutes, because that really changes kind of how people what people do in the meantime, how if they have the context switch or not.
yeah,
Then, um, if people have feedback, how long until they get like what's that
yeah,
process? How much context does the feedback have that's why we ended up shipping our comments product, where like in Figma, you can comment on the preview and say like, here is a problem, right? Versus like screenshot, paste into Linear, whatever issue tracker you use, forgot the URL, forgot to say that they were in Safari, whatever, right? Like there's all these things. Then you ship to production. How long does it take you to validate that it's a good change? How long, if it's a bad change, does it take to roll back? So we shipped a feature really related to SKU protection, but more broadly applicable, called instant rollback. So on Vercel, you can roll back to any previous state in under a second. And this is super powerful, and soon we'll ship a feature in our toolbar to make it even easier. We have a bisecting feature. Because we have immutable deployments, you can bisect your production environment to find where a bug was introduced. And that can, like in an incident, can save you like literally hours. If you're on a more traditional like Kubernetes, like you would have to deploy them all, and then hopefully you think yourself that you bisect the Git, but it would be like an extraordinary effort, right? And here you can do it in real time. So that's all these steps, and it goes even further. But it really makes sense to write down like what the process is, what the interruptions are, and then go micro optimize, because it's really worth optimizing each part in an independent fashion. So obviously, like I was focusing very much on like the software development side, but like once you go into how to give feedback, how to do the planning, they're meetings, etc. are very very key. So
I
we
think
can
you
also
can
go
map.
into that side, but I think that's what I'm focused on.
Sure, I think you can map those as well, right? Especially if you have some, some parts of the process that are about meetings or other things that are not software development, but are always the same, right? Maybe you write a design doc for new features, or you have, the human part of the code review. I mean, there are things that are recurring that belong to the software development, but are not about software itself, the tooling. So I think it's beneficial that you map everything basically, and you can to get
Right.
awareness of where the waste of time is, I think.
I'll give you some semi-sad anecdote, but
Yeah.
so again, like I was leading the desktop search team at Google, and one of my jobs was approvals for launches, and it was an email-based process where the team would write a pretty substantial narrative, because there would always be an experiment, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so they would always the analyst would write down in kind of 2-page length reasoning why the outcome is positive,
Yeah.
and then the product manager would write why it's a good feature, and I would have to say cool, great. And not to be too unfair to my peers, but it was you kind of showed that you were busy but taking a while to approve. In fact, often it was actually just this random person, and they were really busy, and so they would come back with a question after 2 weeks, and the team would scramble, answer it, and 2 weeks later it gets approved. And so it literally takes that's 4 weeks now, and that easily escalates to 6 weeks. So I just set myself the SLA. I want to approve everything within 30 minutes, even if I am in the middle of the meeting, so I have to like multitask. But like the velocity when you get from that is so insane. And I think everyone can ask themselves, like, where am I the bottleneck, and what can I kind of do to no longer be the bottleneck? And the impact can be like, if you're in a leadership position, the impact of that can be very substantial. And people kind of usually don't have that perspective. I think there has been a good development in the attitude towards code reviews, for example. Like when 15 years ago, they were not a thing outside of big tech. And then they kind of took the world by storm, and now they're really normal. But then it gives this opportunity for people to slow things down, that weren't there before. And I think that the world has been trending towards being like more on the side of, if in doubt, approve. And giving people also the benefit of the doubt. So I think if you make a nit on a code review and you don't approve it, like now you make the company slower, right? That's very bad. But it's also very normal, right? Like it's very normal behavior where you don't trust your colleagues to correct your spelling error that you found in a comment, right?
Yeah.
But like, those are the little things, and it's really worth optimizing.
Yeah, totally. So I wanted to keep the last part of the interview to talk a little bit about AI, and I have to start by asking you because you have said you have led the desktop search at Google. You've worked 10 years there, and just yesterday, we had the Google I/O, and there were some of the biggest changes maybe in a decade about how search works, and AI is changing how search works in the web. So are you excited about this? I mean, as an insider who has worked on that for so long. You had talked about experiments there while you were working there. So are you excited about everything that is coming out just in a few months out of the whole AI shift?
So I am excited. I feel it's Google is still, and I obviously have a lot of background there. I actually feel this is a very conservative change that they announced yesterday, which might be a bit of a hot take, but it's so the search engine has been on a trajectory, and they are not changing the trajectory. It's more that AI is additive, and which is probably like that's not necessarily a bad idea, right? And they do have to take into consideration the ecosystem impact. So if you would change to a model where you almost never have to link through to the underlying web page, then
Yeah,
at some point that web page will die, and then that's not good. And so Google does have to have that responsibility in mind, and 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 so certainly this used to always be top of mind because it's a symbiotic relationship, right? Where you do need
yeah,
to have the content to link to, so you can be in the search engine. And if you're the scale of Google, then your actions can have an impact, right? Whereas the
yeah,
Perplexity, like they can focus only on the user experience because nothing they can do at this point has any particular ecosystem impact, right? And
yeah,
the so for now, I feel Google has stayed like I think they did a good job finding a course that kind of on the one hand addresses the threat that comes from the pure AI search engines, but on the other hand, kind of keeps the ecosystem being a relevant player in that overall equation.
yeah. I think it's especially hard for a big player because any change you make, you are under scrutiny, and of course there are already articles about that have come out just today about the threat that Google will not link to external websites to the to the same extent as before, but on one side, to the other side, you can think it's conservative because the UX doesn't change much. There's opportunity to do more. So I think it's always hard to strike a balance. But instead, speaking tech-wise, I think Vercel has been one of the first to support AI application very practically with streaming, with many things. So what's your take about what good AI applications will look like tech-wise? And I'm not talking of the Googles of the world, of the OpenAI. I mean, the rest of us who are not creating our models from scratch, but are building on top of these models. I mean, what are the building blocks, and what will this AI-enabled application look like?
Yeah, I think the notion of the AI engineer is really helpful. Who is a person who doesn't build a model, who calls model APIs, who maybe does a fine tuning, but who does have to do things like evals that we were talking about search. Search has been using for 20 years plus, but they were not a mainstream thing that you had to do because normal computer systems were deterministic and had like finite inputs, and so you could QA them, right? AI systems and a search engine you can't really QA because there's too many inputs, and
Yeah,
so there's some of that coming. But yeah, I think the to answer your question more directly, you already mentioned streaming, so that is a big mindset shift. Like in the traditional programming model, you have like call API, get an answer, you do some
yeah,
post processing, right? That kind of changes, and as these AI APIs are just too slow to wait for the full response to come back.
yeah,
Um, And then we have to think about multi-modality, but I think in a way that's maybe different from what people have top of mind. They think about maybe audio input, video input, photo input, text input. So that's obviously important, but like the on the outside side, the thing that we've been investing in, and I think which kind of puts the ecosystem in a way back together is what we are calling generative UI, where you combine your existing UI with the AI, which is a very powerful concept, right? Like so, like people ship these chatbots left and right. Let's say you have your support chatbot, and you say, "I want to change my password." Like what the current generation can do is say, "Okay, here's the link to chat to change your password."
Yeah.
But your password change thing is probably a React component. And so what we've done is we have said, okay, the AIs now support function calling. React components are just functions.
Yeah.
Why can't the AI call the React component and draw
Of
it to the
course.
screen? Right? It makes a lot of sense. And then there's a mechanism to kind of put state back to the AI, which in this case would be just password change successful or something like that, right?
Yeah.
And here you go, right? And so now you have a fully interactive application that uses your existing UI investment and kind of really ties these things together, which I think
Yeah.
is you know it's it's an answer to I think a question that many of us have to answer for our businesses today. Is it's like what is my role as an engineer, as a company in the disrupted world of AI? And
Yeah.
in a way, this kind of starts to provide an answer, right?
Yeah.
Because it shows, yeah, I mean, if I want to book a flight, I still need a seat map because it's a better UI modality than the AI telling me, well, seat 15B is open. Would you like that seat? No. Okay. How about
Yeah.
17A? Makes no sense, right? And I think that's like like that. Yeah. So they're basically a path being chartered that
Yeah.
combines some of the work that we've been doing in the past with the work that we're going to do in the future.
Yeah. That's very interesting. Do you think that applications are going to adapt to make themselves more easily usable by AI agents doing things? So exposing, I mean, we have function calling, and all these things. So we are going to adapt applications so that AI gets better at using them.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's a symbiotic relationship, and things are kind of things are obviously developing, but yeah, we're going to give the AI the capability to hook into existing business processes as existing, like I'm talking about UI, but really obviously that UI is hooked to your business, right? Like that's kind
Yeah.
of the because the AI, the way people interact with it, that's a user interface, right? And so the question is how to put these things together. Yeah, I think the agent world is really interesting.
Yeah.
I it's it's early days. I'm definitely thinking about a world in which many applications are used by AI.
Yeah.
So that puts top of mind, first of all, bug protection. So bug protection today is I don't want a non-human to use my thing. That will probably not stay, right? Like if I have an AI device and I say, book me a flight, then and the flight website said, well, you're not a human, you can't book a flight here. That's
Yeah.
not great. So yes, it's so we're kind of more in the speculative realm, but you know, I think OIDC as a distributed signing mechanism is really interesting. And so one of the
Mm-mm.
things that I want to drive in the future is some notion of like non-human players on the internet having a way to cryptographically sign their identity into the work they do, so that
Yeah.
the parties can kind of professionally manage their relationships and build trust, right? And so forth.
Yeah. I mean, this is so interesting. I know it's speculative, but thinking about how the equivalent of APIs and specs and like can change to be consumed not by developers and humans, anymore directly, but by agents, and what this world looks like, and the challenges, as you said, designing all the things. It's very, very interesting. And do you think also on the backend side, um, we will use LLMs to replace part of what we used to do with declarative code? I mean, will we have at some point some backends that are just LLMs that output JSON through and push them through API?
Yeah, I actually don't think so. I mean I mean maybe that's too bold and too general of an answer, but because obviously that will exist, right? But especially if the AI is good, it will decide that it's better to write a program
Yeah,
and have the program execute the task than to have the next work prediction LLM predict the output, which is extraordinarily inefficient, right?
yeah, I
And
agree.
so obviously the AI will help you write the program, it will help you write the backend, but it makes, from an execution model point of view, it makes sense to kind of keep things in a way the way they are, right? Not
Yeah.
saying there won't be any change, but I don't actually think that for many common tasks, it makes sense to use the LLM as the execution model.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's also, the slowest and most expensive thing you can think of, as opposed maybe the only
Right.
thing that is more
No, I
expensive
mean,
is
like
making things done by people. But if you can do it
if
with code
you
in any other
if
way,
you at Google scale, right,
yeah,
you no longer talk about compute, you talk about electricity usage.
yeah, exactly.
Um, and if you are already at some measurable percentage of world electricity usage, you
Yeah,
cannot buy more, and so you
yeah,
cannot actually, even if it technically would be possible, move to a technology that uses 100 times as much electricity. Like that's just
yeah,
not impossible, right? So they're at the limit unless you make the AI more efficient, which isn't impossible. Like our brains are dramatically more efficient
yeah.
than current generation LMs, so that could happen. But certainly for the time being, there are just kind of limits around what's possible.
Yeah, yeah. And I have a final question also about AI, because you are a maintainer of a very popular open source framework. So are you more concerned or excited about the role of AI in the development process, uh, with respect to open source model, which is changing in a way, right? With Copilot and the things, the AI is taking what we have written so far, and maybe there is not really feedback loop. AI may churn bugs or things, and we are not able to improve how things are done. I mean, are you concerned about AI changing how open source works, or how this model has worked so far? Or are you more excited by the productivity gains and how and about all the things we can achieve?
I'm definitely more excited about it. I think one interesting aspect is how to optimize a framework like Next.js to be a better target for LLMs.
Yeah,
And I wouldn't say that we have an answer for that yet, but I think it's a really interesting question. Like, kind of comes down to what we also discussed earlier, where in the future, your user is not necessarily a developer.
yeah,
I
yeah,
think the one big change is that the the cost distribution of certain tasks around software engineering changes.
mm,
So the marginal line of code writing it goes down, the cost goes down.
yeah,
Um, there is a possible future in which the cost of maintaining code goes down quite a bit,
mm,
and so that's why I have this hot take that we're like going to the opposite future of low code, right? We're going to have a lot of code, and we're going to have amazing tooling to like maintain all that code and to like make sense of it and to understand it.
yeah,
And that's kind of like uh so that's a somewhat different world. And I think that as the role of the human changes, the comprehensibility of code becomes very important. Obviously that was always important, but if I'm like the author and I'm like the primary consumer, like I mean there was always like the poor maintenance programmer who had to like read it 3 years
yeah,
later. But that was like maybe I wasn't thinking about this, but now like there's a more immediate kind of challenge that comprehensibility of what is being authored is important. And on the other hand, because it's so cheap to write a line of code, density of writing becomes almost irrelevant. And that's actually good. Like it's a good combination. Like you don't want it to be too verbose that's hard to read, but you can, if you make trade-off in like micro API design, you can focus more on the read time than on the write time. Where in the past, I think people do have focused quite dramatically on the write time. I'll give you this actually has nothing to do with AI, but like people used to optimize how much code you had to write to import a function. Like in JavaScript, for example, you can package things together, so it's all coming from the same file. Yeah. And then you only have one statement and you add a line. Like, who cares about that when you never write that thing by hand, right? And even like VS Code can do it just from autocomplete, right? And it will pop it up there. But like, it's a change where where previous concern kind of goes away. And I think we'll see a lot of that type of change in the future.
Yeah, I mean, you gave me a lot of food for thought. I mean, thinking of how many language features are there because they're optimized for the human experience, and how languages can instead change when the bulk of the code is written by machines, for example.
That's right. I think for now, right, I mean, these things can change, but because of the knowledge cutoffs of the LLMs, that actually puts a very, very awkward kind of path on API evolution. Yeah. Because the LLM doesn't know about the new API. and you can kind of feed it with some kind of RAG or fine-tuning mechanism, but like that would always be kind of somewhat targeted. But in the grand scheme of things, but then also if no one uses the new API because the LLM doesn't know it yet, then there isn't any training data for when it finally kind of catches up on the major training. And so I am kind of interested in if we kind of get stuck in a way on like November 2021. API design. But yeah, we'll see.
I used to make a joke that, I mean, we don't know if we had AI back then that were able to write perfect jQuery, where would we have ever invented React, for example? Maybe we would have got stuck, as you said, because we wouldn't have cared.
Yeah, I'll give you one example where, so generally speaking, I actually don't agree with that, because everything that's good for humans is also good for AIs. They are very similar in certain ways. And the most extreme example, I think, is Tailwind. So, which is maybe the audience doesn't know, but it's a way of writing CSS where you rather than having the styling be separate from the markup, which would be the old best practice, you just put it in line. And that, without going too much into detail, that's amazing for LLMs because they don't have to do reasoning across large blocks of code. And they don't have to maybe they write the style first and then later they kind of have to fit it's all one thing. And that works remarkably well. And that's one of the reasons why our v0.dev generative UI tool that gives you UI for your prompts. That's why it works so well, because the LLM happens to be extraordinarily good at Tailwind.
Yeah.
And so I think that's maybe the most extreme API example for an API that just that was loved by humans.
Yeah.
But also hated, right? But from an LLM perspective, it's the absolute
divisive,
best.
Let's say, but yes, loved by many. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it was a great example, and so I'm mindful of your time, Malte. So thank you again for being here with us today. It was a fantastic chat. I took so many notes, and so thank you again.
Thanks for having me. This was super fun. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. If you found this chat valuable, you can subscribe to the show on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Also, please consider giving us a rating or leaving a review, as that really helps other listeners find the show. You can find all past episodes and learn more about the show at refactoring.fm. See you in the next episode.